Welcome to a 1-hour Pallium Project archival podcast of a professional development event. The views presented in this session are those of our expert guests and participants from across Canada. In this podcast, Beth Lipsett interviews Victoria Hospice Society's Wendy Wainwright. This session is entitled Supporting the Bereaved Through the Holiday Season.
I think we wanted to start, Beth, talking about grief and bereavement, just to give people a sense of the normal expected kind of process that people who are grieving a death could be going through at this time of year. I think what's important for people to remember is that it's a normal, expected life experience that is related to adjusting to loss in one's life. It's important not to pathologize that experience. So grief is a process of accommodation or adjustment to what has occurred, and integration of a death or a loss into one's life. I think also as bereaved people work through their grief, what they're also doing is finding ways to create a new relationship with the person who has died, a way to move forward in their life without that person, but yet to take the connections and the past relationships that they had with them forward. Another thing that strikes me, or that I'd like to say about grief, is much like we always say in hospice palliative care that pain is what the patient says it is. Well, I think that's also true of grief, that grief is what the person says it is. It includes feelings of anger, sadness, guilt, depression. I'm sure you're all able to relate to these kinds of things as you think about your own losses and your own grief. And I think also for me, as I think about grief, I think about it as a search for meaning or purpose in life. Having a sense of what did this relationship mean to my life? In fact, what did the death mean? What is the purpose of this whole experience? And how am I going to find meaning in my life without this person and without my life with them?
Do you think that looking for meaning is an essential part of integrating the loss?
Absolutely, yes. I think as human beings, how we connect to life is the meaning that we make of it. And if your life is going along in a certain direction and all of a sudden that direction changes, there's that process of trying to sort out, well, why did that happen? And what am I going to do with it now? How am I going to make a future for myself? How am I going to find a way to cope with what's happening? What do I want the rest of my life to be about? Maybe another thing is that grief is a process. And it's a process that involves moving through various transitions. In our material here at Victoria Hospice, we talk about the image of the labyrinth as a way to think about the grief process. And so as I kind of think about the first phase of grief, if you will, that occurs when a death has happened, we talk about that as being walking the edges. And this is a beginning that brings recognition that the death has occurred. And the death and the grief that results from that event are the primary experience at this time. So it's often a time we see people quite numb, in shock, going through the motions, that kind of thing. And what the process involves at that point is people trying to cognitively understand that this death has occurred. The second phase, if you will, if you think of the labyrinth, we talk about entering the depths, so moving into the center of that labyrinth. And I hope people are familiar with labyrinths because they're not like a maze where the point of the maze is to try and get lost or to lose you, but in fact a labyrinth is a very predictable guided walk, if you will, to the center, and then you return back out via the same path. And so if you think about moving toward the center of the labyrinth, entering the depths of your grief, and this is the point where the reality of that death moves from being an intellectual recognition that it has occurred to being a deep emotional or cognitive-based experience. So it moves from the head to the heart, if you will.
Do you find that people go through that process at different rates? They may stay walking the edges longer or entering the depth.
I think so, Beth, and that could vary depending on the person's grieving style. It could vary depending upon cultural implications, personality of the person, but certainly everyone will have their own rhythm and their own way of moving through this.
Terrific. That's good to know.
And I think in this process of entering the death and becoming immersed in the experience of pain, if you will, that people really move from reviewing the death itself to reviewing the relationship, really living their life without the person who has died. So going through life as a new experience, in fact. Often people feeling very uncertain about the future, feeling very overwhelmed by the experience at this time and wondering if things will ever feel different. Then from there, if you will, the third phase, moving back to the outside of the labyrinth from the center, we think about that as reconnecting us with the world. And this is a time when people begin to move away from focusing on the death and focusing more on life. They're now integrating this experience more into their life as it is. They're mending their hearts, if you will, looking toward the future, having a sense of creating a new normal, a new life for themselves.
I would imagine that when we come to a place where significant events are happening, anniversaries, and for us, and our topic today, the holiday season, people must feel a different kind of shift when they think that they have done that work and moved forward, and then Christmas shows up. Mm-hmm. And what can you talk a little bit about what that might be like for people?
What comes to mind just as you're talking, Beth, I think sometimes people might in fact be surprised that the grief is even still there, that this is a time that traditionally may have been a joyful or a time of celebration, and in fact it looks very different for them. And as you said, I think all holidays, special dates, anniversaries, particularly I think the first time that people ever go through them, are pretty much all challenging. So why is it that the holiday season is perhaps particularly challenging for people, I guess? One of the things that I notice is that people often begin to have this anticipated sense of dread almost as early as November. And I don't know about the communities, other communities across the country, but I certainly noticed that in Victoria that on November the 1st they take the Halloween decorations down and they put the Christmas decorations up. And so right from that time it's beginning for people. I think another factor is that it's the time of year as well. Winter is approaching. Certainly in our part of the country, it's gray and rainy. Other parts of the country, it's probably snowy. People are quite isolated. It's an indoors time. There's less light. So I think just that piece of it, in fact, can complicate people's grief. I think the thing about this particular season is that it's not an individual event. It's a community event, whether it be Christmas or Hanukkah or whatever celebration people have, that it's publicly declared. And it's everywhere that you go. It's relentless, in fact. People, I think, often feel bombarded. They watch the calendar, they see the decorations in the stores, it's on television, it's in the newspaper. You drive down the street, the Christmas lights are up. It's impossible, I think, to escape the reminders.
And this time of year, regardless of how you celebrate, traditionally we celebrate with the people that we feel closest to. I would imagine it feels very much like there is a hole, like a piece of the puzzle is missing.
Absolutely. That's a really good point, Beth. I think it's a place of stark contrast for people, of past pleasant memories of that person being there, and that's being placed in contrast or juxtaposition with the current reality that this person has died and is no longer in their life. So it's almost a collision, I think, of past and present. And I think sometimes what we can be inclined to do is kind of lift up past events, and so past Christmases or Hanukkahs are being seen as being perfect. So how on earth am I going to compete with that this year?
Right. Even if they weren't perfect.
Absolutely. And I'd like to just touch on that too, because we talk so much about the celebration and the joy and those kinds of things around Christmas, but for a lot of people, At the best of times, it's not that kind of a season. So I think for people who had unhappy remembrances or events in the past, what they're left with is the sense that they can never make it any different, or they can never make it better. What they're left with is the reality of what they had in the past.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
You also mentioned, Beth, though, about how often people feel like they're going back in their grief because things are so heightened for them at this time of year. And I think that's a really important point. The grief process, of course, is not a linear kind of process. It's one step forward, two steps back. It's going in circles. It's waves, whatever the images are that we use to think about it. And so I think this time of year can really heighten people's anxiety about ability to cope and fear about what's ahead. I think it can heighten their sense of guilt about having a time of celebration or a time with family where this person who died can no longer be, and sadness that they won't be there to share in the anticipation and the activities.
Yeah. But just when you think that you might have accomplished that sense of integration and moving forward, and wondering if you have to start back at the beginning again.
Absolutely, yeah.
So what is helpful as we try to assist families?
And I'm just thinking about the expectations that people have around this holiday time of year. And I think those expectations occur on a number of levels. I think as individuals, we have expectations about how we should be or what it is that we want. I think our families and the bereaved families have expectations about that. And then I think also then those community expectations around celebration and joy and music and all those kinds of things. So I think that's another piece where people can really struggle is regard to expectations.
That's right. When most of us listening to you speak are working daily with families, and it can be very challenging to know how to assist people as they find themselves at this season when there are all of these expectations and they're still feeling this sense of sorrow over the death of their loved one.
Yeah.
So where do we go? How do we be helpful?
As I think about what's helpful for bereaved people, I think maybe two things I would say. One is preparation, and the other is flexibility. I think for myself, as I'm anticipating something in the future, preparation is part of what gets you through it. You anticipate what's coming up, and you try and think about how you're going to manage, and you go into it feeling more confident. I think that's also true for the bereaved as they anticipate the holiday season. And I think the flexibility piece is about it won't be exactly what you expect. And if you have the ability to kind of let go of some things as you're going along or adapt to what it is that comes up, then that can have a better feeling as well. I think for us as care providers, there's a whole lot of ideas about ways that we can support people, but I think there's some general principles that we use whenever we're supporting people who are bereaved or grieving. Things like acknowledging the experience that the person is having. So in this case, acknowledging that this likely will be a difficult time for the person, and to be willing to hear their story and be present to what it is that they need to tell us or want to tell, and to not judge what it is that we're hearing. Some of the don'ts are to not make assumptions about people's experience based on our own experience, because, of course, as we said earlier, everyone grieves differently depending on their age, their culture, their grieving style, whatever it may be.
Right.
And not to give advice. It's so tempting for us, I think, when we see someone struggling or in pain, that we want to offer some helpful advice. You know, because what happens, advice is based on my experience and what works for me. And it doesn't acknowledge the other person's experience and what would work for them. And so what is helpful is for us to help them find what would work for them. So those are probably some general kinds of comments about being helpful. As I think about preparation for the holidays, there were kind of three key places or areas, if you will, that I thought we could be helpful to people. One area is around their grief and caring for themselves through the time ahead. The second area is around relationships, and the third area is around the holiday events themselves. So with regard to people's grief and caring for themselves through the time ahead, the kinds of things I think that are very helpful is acknowledging how their grief and the loss is heightened at this time, and that's really normal. And we might want to ask people, if they're not telling us that, we might want to open the possibility by saying something like, I know often for people it's really difficult as they look ahead to the holiday season. Is that something that you're experiencing right now? So it just gives people permission to talk about it, and it normalizes it for people. Another thing that's helpful is to realize that they're going to have highs and lows, that there's going to be positive and negative aspects to the experience. And for them to think about how they're going to support themselves or deal with those things as they encounter them. I think around their grief as well, it's really helpful for people to think about if they want to talk about or honor or think about ways to include the person who died in the holiday season. And of course, there's lots of ideas about that, limited, I think, only by people's imagination. But that might be things like lighting a candle or doing a memory activity, having a prayer or a toast. In fact, I have just a very short letter here from one of our bereaved clients who had just come through the holiday season. Thanks for remembering the anniversary of Aggie's death. All of the family were at my son's house this holiday weekend for what we thought was going to be a sad occasion. Frankly, I was dreading it and didn't even want to go. Surprisingly, however, the weekend was anything but sad. Certainly there were some tears, but for the most part it was a celebration with a lot of reminiscing and a lot of laughter. The grandchildren decorated a table, and we visited places we had gone as a family when we all lived in Victoria. I had prepared a biography of Aggie and my life together from the first time we met until Aggie's death last year, and I presented the small document to each of my 4 children as a gift. We looked at old slides and shared stories and memories. It was a very rich experience and a wonderful weekend together. And so just for this man, in anticipating what might be ahead and the family thinking about things that they could do together, became something more than he could have even imagined.
And the fact that he was open to that happening.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think also it's very important for us to give the bereaved people permission to take care of themselves through the holidays, to really consider their own needs. Mm-hmm. And not put those on the back burner. And so, all the things that we know about that help us be healthy in terms of exercise and rest and support and being gentle and patient and kind to oneself. Those are really good reminders. People sometimes forget what it is that they can do to take care of themselves. And I think that probably the final little piece in this grief section is encourage them to trust their own instincts, their own reactions and intuitions about what's right for them right now. People don't trust what they intuitively feel. They're bereaved, and it's a good reminder for them that, in fact, they do have what they need to get through this time.
And I think sometimes the concern of family and friends that this is going to be a rough time just accentuates that doubt sometimes.
Absolutely, yeah. Which is a nice segue into the next area that I think is key, and that's about relationships. One of the most important things for people to think about is communicate. That it's really important for families and friends to sit down ahead of time and really talk about what they're concerned about, talk about what it is that they need and how they're grieving, and try and do some planning together about how they can move through this time. One of the things that we certainly see in families, whether it's at this time of year or any time of year, is that everybody in the family grieves a little bit differently, or a lot differently, and that can make it hard to support one another, I think. And so just kind of reminding people that everyone has their own style of grief and their own pace of grief, and it won't look the same. I think it's a good reminder for people that under this stressful time, likely those differences may become more apparent.
Yes.
And to be okay with asking for help. I wonder how many people on this teleconference have trouble asking for help. I suspect that most of the hands will go up.
Yeah.
And so it's a good reminder that other people are often wondering how they can support the bereaved person and may not want to ask or may be uncertain about what to do. And so encourage people to ask for a little bit of help at this time. And that then brings me to the third area, key area that I thought about, and that's with regard to the holiday activities and events themselves. And I kind of think of this as customizing the holiday. So we talked about creating a flexible plan, something that can change, but really do think about what are the traditions that people really want to keep or that are really important. And also think about what are the things that they could let go of. For some people, it may be very important to hold to a number of traditional activities or ways of doing things. Other people may just want to run away and have nothing of the familiar. And so giving people a chance to kind of sort through where they sit on that continuum, really helpful.
And it may be different the first year than it is the second, I would imagine.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing about being the first year is if people decide to change things this first year, they can always go back to doing something familiar the next year.
Yeah.
It's never written in stone. And I'm thinking actually about a couple of women who came to one of our preparing for the holiday sessions, and they had both been recently widowed and did not have family in town. And I guess both really wondered what on earth were they going to do for this first holiday season on their own. And I guess they made a connection and got together afterwards for coffee, and they ended up both packing up and going to Hawaii together.
That's wonderful.
Yes, that was very creative.
Yeah.
Also, I think to encourage people or give people permission to pare down their expectations. And I'm thinking about a lot of those practical things, sending cards, doing baking, decorating, shopping. There's different ways to do things or to not do it all. I think of a woman who received a whole number of cards prior to Christmas, and of course people were also, acknowledging that her husband had died or didn't know, and so it was very difficult for her, and she really hated these joyful expressions of the holiday season, if you will, and did not want to send Christmas cards and didn't quite know what to do with it. And she was, in fact, quite an instrumental griever. And we often talk around grief about people who are intuitive grievers who express their grief emotionally and connect with other people on that level. And at the other end of that continuum are the instrumental grievers who are more cognitively based, who express their grief more through activity and conquering problems and dealing with issues. And this woman kind of tended toward that instrumental end, I guess. And so what she did was she took all those Christmas cards that she found so difficult and almost irritating, and she took a paper making course. She took them all, made them into new paper, made cards, and sent the cards out to those people. And
isn't that remarkable?
It is, and so she completed the circle, if you will, but she found a way to make it work for herself.
That's great.
So I think we can really encourage people to think about doing things differently if that's what they want to do.
Absolutely. Because so many of us doing this kind of work, we get connected to the patients and the families that we work with. As you mentioned, all of us have loss in our own lives as well that can be triggered just as easily by this season.
Absolutely.
And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how our own grief can impact our ability to care for the people that we're working with.
I guess, Beth, really that's true at any time that we're working with people who are grieving, that often the potential is there that our own grief is triggered. And as people who work in this field, it's something I think that we encounter. And so how is it that we keep our own pain and suffering as separate from the pain and suffering of the people we're working with? You know, we need to work with awareness is certainly one piece. We need to know what our own triggers are. We need to pay attention to our own grief and our own sorrow and our own pain. And we need to make sure that we have ways to process that, to deal with that, whether it be through our own self-care, whether it be through journaling or counseling or whatever it is. So one piece is being proactive as well. Not only do we need to be aware of our own grief, we also need to have ways to deal with it. You know, I live in a small urban center, I guess you might say, and so in some ways there are some natural kinds of boundaries that occur. It's not often that I would work with someone that I know, but that's not true for many of our communities across the country where people know the people who have died, they know the people who are grieving, and how much harder it is then to separate out or to make sure that our own grief doesn't override someone else's. So, of course, working with awareness again is absolutely critical with that. And I think, you know, for us to know at what point does our empathy become something different. So it's that awareness about whose grief is it here.
Yes, I think that's a challenge for people because you can't help but be connected. And as you said, in small communities, you are attending the same church, you are shopping in the same grocery stores, and I would imagine those boundaries are very difficult to maintain.
Yeah, and so likely then all the more important to have strategies for that in terms of, do you have colleagues who you debrief with? Do you write about your grief? Do you have your own counselor? What is it that you need to do in order to attend to your own? Because when I think about psychosocial care, which is what we're really talking about, to me, the main tool that we bring to that kind of care is ourselves. And so if we think of ourselves as a tool, then we need to care for it. We need to make sure that it's sharp and that it's well-oiled and that it gets its yearly tune-up. In order to care for others, then, of course, as we all know, we must care for ourselves. And I think that that's particularly true at this time of year. And there may be times when we need to say, you know what, this is just too close to home. No, there's too much similarity here for me. My life circumstance matches theirs, or I know them too well, or whatever it is, that we need to maybe say, I'm not the best person to be the supporter right now.
Great. Well, I want to thank you. Some of what you've said just makes such good sense. I'd like to see if there are questions from the audience.
Hello, this is actually Nancy Castleberry attending the same conference with Sheila Dion. Thank you very much. Excellent presentation. I had a couple of comments about the advice that was given in terms of supporting children through the holidays. For the most part, I agreed with what was there, but I had some concerns about asking children what they find most comforting and meaningful, and also letting children know that whatever they are feeling is okay. Reason being, I don't know that children, if you ask them, like, how are you going to be comforted, or how can this be meaningful, that really is a very sophisticated question that you might run past an adult. But a youth or a child griever, I'm not sure that that's how that needs to be worded, to ask the child what they find comforting. I think if you're the adult, the caring adult, you know what your child likes, you know what your child finds comforting.
Great point, Nancy. And certainly anything that you say to children has to be in the context of developmental level and age and relationship and understanding. And so, of course, you're absolutely right that you wouldn't necessarily ask a question in such a way. Perhaps a better way to think about it would be, it's important to attend to what it is that children find comforting and find a way to acknowledge and include that in the planning at the time.
Thank you. Very much, yes, I like that. The second thing is about, again, I think your point about the age of the child, the developmental age of the child. So often in grief work, I hear people talking about children expressing their feelings. That may be true for adolescents, but really younger children they're not very good at articulating what they're feeling. They're more to act out what they're feeling. Behavioral markers will tell us what they're feeling, but they're not going to say, I'm sad, necessarily. You get the occasional younger child, but usually they're crying, or they're petting their dog, or they're quiet, or they're acting up. So I just wanted to comment that very frequently younger children do not know what they are, quote, feeling, or they can't say what they're feeling.
I think that's a good point, and in some ways they're a lot like those instrumental grievers who are much less likely to talk about or express their emotions. They're much more likely to act them out or work them out through other ways. And you're quite right. We often see kids working things out through their behaviors or their play rather than their words. And I think that's probably true of kids developmentally in lots of ways, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi, I have quite a few that have Christmas, grieving, and suicide all together at the same time. Do you approach it any different?
Well, I guess the challenge of that is that there's a whole lot of stuff going on at one time. And so people's grief at that point is likely to be very complex for them as well as for us trying to help them. And that it may be very difficult for them to even tease out what it is that they're struggling with at this point. So I think I would, approach it as someone who's dealing with multiple losses and someone who's at very high risk, likely for difficulty in their grief, and start slowly. And it's hard to answer that sort of very quickly, but I think all I could do without sort of spending half an hour talking about interventions would be to acknowledge that that's going to be complex.
Would you address the suicide directly as well?
I would, yes.
Okay.
I think one of the things that people can often struggle with in their grief is social stuff. And one of the social things that often happens in our culture, if you will, is that people aren't very comfortable talking about death. And when death has a stigma attached to it, like suicide, then I think people struggle even more to talk about it. And I think as supporters, one of the most important things we do is that we name things. That things are not shameful, they're not to be hidden. Obviously, you take your cue from the person that you're working with, but that this is something that we can talk about, and this is something that we can hopefully work through together. And I think it's a time often, I don't know, your experience or your training, so don't be offended if I say this, but I think that this may often be a time as well where a referral to a professional might be a good idea.
Can you identify a single most problematic and or frequent impediment to the natural process of grief processing? Would it be culture or secularism, materialistic needs?
Just off the top, and so this is kind of a gut response, the thing that might be most challenging for grief for people is a perceived lack of support. People who feel isolated, misunderstood. What do you think, Beth?
I would agree. I think that probably one of the most difficult things for people is that they feel very alone in their grief. Yep. And they really need someone who, as you've said previously, who listens, who's non-judgmental, and who is just present with them and allows them to be wherever they happen to be. That's been my experience.
Yeah.
Are there particularly problematic cultures, or by cultures I mean more than just capital C, I mean like secularism, the culture of secularism, or the culture of poverty, or possibly racial or national cultures? Is there a particularly problematic one that you found?
Well, I think there's so many things that complicate our experience of grief. And we can talk about our culture and the challenges that we have in terms of ritualizing our grief and acknowledging and that kind of thing. And I suspect each culture has its own challenges. I think often where people may struggle, and it kind of connects to that idea of sense of isolation, is if they have dissonance with their culture, if they don't if their experience or expression doesn't fit in with the predominant kind of culture expectations. So that's a really, really big can of worms.
Okay, so even if, like myself, you come from trailer trash culture, as long as you feel connected to it, you'd be okay, right?
Yeah, why not?
Okay, thank you.
So, Wendy, I wanted to thank you very much. Do you have anything you'd like to close with?
Of course I do. Of course I do. One thing I'd just like to mention, the handouts that people got, plus all our other bereavement handouts, are available just for downloading off our Victoria Hospice website. So if that's something that would be helpful, it's www.victoriahospice.org. And there's also a list of bereavement books and resources. There's a few good little grief and the holidays kinds of books available, and I believe those are referenced on the website. I think in terms of things to remember, supporting bereaved people through the holidays or at any time, is that we need to remember that it's about our relationship with them. So we need to be genuine, to be ourselves, to listen, be patient, and to not make assumptions about their experience. I think that it's important we have knowledge, that we familiarize ourselves with the grief process, for example, or familiarize ourselves with some of the issues that people might be facing with. And it's also important to remember there is no right way to grieve. And then finally, I think we need to take care of ourselves and to remember that this isn't something for us to fix, that we cannot take people's pain away, that it is their pain and their experience. We need to remember that our own grief may be triggered as well. Great. Do I have time for just a final reading?
Sure.
Okay. And it's Khalil Gibran from The Prophet, with apologies to him for abridging this. Your joy is your sorrow unmasked, and the self-same well from which your laughter rises was oftentimes filled with your tears. The deeper that sorrow carves into your being, the more joy you can contain. When you are joyous, look deep into your heart, and you shall find it is only that which has given you sorrow that is giving you joy. When you are sorrowful, look again into your heart, and you shall see that in truth you are weeping for that which has been your delight. Some of you say joy is greater than sorrow, and others say, nay, sorrow is the greater. But I say unto you, they are inseparable. Together they come, and when one sits alone with you at your board, remember that the other is asleep upon your bed. Verily, you are suspended like scales between your sorrow and your joy. And I just think that is just so true of people's experience at this time of year.
That's really a nice way to close. It's a good fit. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wendy, just in summary, some of the messages that we can take away with us, that the grief process is normal and it's to be expected, that grief is whatever the person says it is, and that grief is not something to be resolved, but rather integrated into one's life. I think that if we can remember those things, we'll probably all be able to best support the people we're working with.
This has been a Pallium Project Professional Development Podcast. For more information on the Pallium Project, including written transcripts of this session, please visit www.pallium.ca. Pallium.